I caught them again, HOA members cutting straight across my lawn like it belonged to them. No warning. No permission. Just footprints, tire marks, and that smug confidence that says, "What are you gonna do about it?" I complained. I documented. I followed every rule they forced on me. And they laughed, told me it was community access. That's when I stopped arguing and started planning. Because overnight, one small change turned their daily shortcut into a very expensive lesson. By morning, the same people who ignored my rights were panicking, blaming each other, and desperately trying to undo what they'd done. They thought I'd roll over. They forgot one thing. Karma doesn't need permission. Stay till the end, because the HOA never saw this coming. I never thought a lawn could turn into a battlefield. But that's exactly what happened. When I bought my house, the lawn was one of the things I loved most. It wasn't huge. It wasn't fancy. But it was mine. Fresh grass. Clean edges. A small tree near the sidewalk. It felt peaceful. Like a buffer between the world and my front door. The neighborhood had an HOA. I knew that going in. I read the rules. I paid the fees. I kept my grass trimmed to the exact height they demanded. I followed their paint color rules. Their trash can rules. Their parking rules. I did everything right. At first, everything seemed fine. Then one morning, I noticed something odd. A thin dirt line across my lawn. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe a delivery truck rolled a tire too close. Maybe kids cut across by accident. Grass grows back, right? I ignored it. A few days later, the line was darker. Wider. Clear footprints pressed into the soil. Someone had clearly walked across my lawn. Not just once. Repeatedly. Still, I gave the benefit of the doubt. People make mistakes. But then it kept happening. Every morning, more flattened grass. More shoe marks. One day, even bike tracks. A clear diagonal path from the sidewalk on one side, to the street on the other. They weren't stepping near my lawn. They were cutting straight across it. I stood at my window one afternoon and watched. A man in a polo shirt with an HOA logo walked across like it was a sidewalk. Didn't even look at the house. Just crossed. Phone in hand. Casual. Confident. That's when it hit me. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. I walked outside and looked closer. The grass wasn't just bent. It was damaged. Roots exposed in places. Mud starting to show. My neat lawn was slowly turning into a dirt shortcut. And it made my stomach twist. I didn't want drama. I didn't want conflict. So I did what a reasonable person would do. I sent a polite email. I wrote to the HOA office. I explained the situation calmly. I included photos. I said I understood people might not realize it was private property. I asked if they could remind staff and residents to stay on sidewalks. That was it. No threats. No attitude. 2 days later, I got a reply. Short. Cold. Dismissive. They said they'd look into it. Nothing changed. The next week, the path got worse. Now it wasn't just staff. Neighbors started using it too. One woman pushing a stroller. A teen cutting through with headphones on. Even a guy walking his dog, leash dragging across my grass like it meant nothing. I put up a small sign. Please stay off the lawn. Simple. Polite. Clear. The next morning, the sign was knocked over. And someone had walked right past it. That's when frustration turned into something heavier. Anger mixed with disbelief. Because here's the thing. The HOA was obsessed with rules. They fined people for weeds. For garbage cans being visible too long. For cars parked a few inches wrong. But when it came to my property, suddenly, rules didn't matter. I decided to speak to them in person. At the next HOA meeting, I stood up. My voice was calm. My hands were steady. I explained everything again. The damage. The photos. The sign. I said, I just want people to respect my property. The room went quiet. Then the HOA president smiled. Not a friendly smile. A tight one. She said, That area has always been used as a pass-through. I looked at her and said, "It's my lawn." She shrugged. Actually shrugged. And said, "It's not a big deal. It's community flow." Community flow. I felt my face heat up. I reminded her that the HOA rules clearly stated no one could trespass on private property. I even quoted the section. I had read it. More than once. She leaned back in her chair and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes rules are flexible. That was it. Flexible when it benefits them. Rigid when it punishes everyone else. After the meeting, a few neighbors pulled me aside. Some whispered apologies. Some told me they agreed but didn't want trouble. One guy laughed and said, "Yeah, they do whatever they want." That night, I walked outside and stood on my lawn. The grass was torn up. Ugly. A scar right through the middle of something I cared about. And I realized something important. If I let this go, it wouldn't stop. They had decided my property was convenient. They had decided my rights were optional. And they had no intention of changing. I went back inside and pulled out the HOA rulebook. The same one they loved to use against everyone else. I read it carefully. Line by line. I highlighted sections. I took notes. I compared maps and property lines from the county records. I printed everything. And the more I read, the clearer it became. They weren't just being rude. They were breaking their own rules. Over and over. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry, but because an idea had started to form. A quiet one. A patient one. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to threaten. I wasn't going to beg. If they wanted to ignore the rules, I would follow them perfectly. And I would let karma do the rest. The next morning, I woke up calmer than I had been in days. Not calm like everything was fine. Calm like a decision had been made. When people feel powerless, they usually react fast. They yell. They post online. They confront. I had done none of that. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a thick stack of papers. The HOA rulebook. The same book they used to fine my neighbor for leaving his trash can out 2 hours too long. The same book they quoted whenever someone painted a door the wrong shade of beige. If rules mattered so much to them, then rules would matter now. I started from the beginning. Slow. Careful. No skimming. Section after section talked about property lines. About common areas. About private ownership. About responsibility and liability. One line stood out immediately. No resident or association representative may use private property as a thoroughfare without written permission from the owner. I read it twice. Then a third time. That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't bending the rules. They were flat out violating them. I flipped to another section. Landscaping standards. Property damage. Restoration responsibility. Fines for unauthorized access. The HOA wasn't just allowing trespassing. They were creating legal risk. And that's when something clicked. HOAs don't fear complaints. They fear documentation. I decided to stop asking them to do the right thing. Instead, I would record them doing the wrong thing. I went online and ordered a small outdoor camera. Nothing flashy. Just something that covered the lawn. Wide angle. Motion detection. Time stamps. I installed it carefully. High enough to be subtle. Low enough to capture faces and paths. I made sure it was fully legal. My property. My camera. No audio. Then I waited. It didn't take long. The very first day, I caught 5 people crossing. One was an HOA maintenance worker. Logo clear as day. Clipboard in hand. Walking like he owned the place. Another was the HOA President herself. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight across my lawn. And she smiled while doing it. That one hurt more than I expected. Not because she crossed, but because she knew exactly what she was doing. Over the next week, I collected footage. Dates. Times. Faces. Patterns. Morning rush. Afternoon shortcuts. Evening dog walkers. It was constant. The path on my lawn was now obvious. A brown stripe where grass used to be. Neighbors no longer even pretended it was accidental. They followed the dirt trail like it was paved. One afternoon, I stepped outside while someone was halfway across. "Hey," I said. "Calm. Firm." The man stopped, looked down at the grass, then back at me. "Oh," he said. "The HOA said this was fine." That sentence made my jaw tighten. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I didn't realize." They said it was fine. I told him it wasn't. That it was private property. That I had asked them to stop. He shrugged and kept walking. That night, I added another layer. I sent a second email to the HOA. This one wasn't emotional. It wasn't long. It was professional. I referenced the exact rule number. The exact wording. I attached photos. I stated clearly that unauthorized access was continuing. I asked for written clarification on why HOA representatives were exempt from the rules. I gave them 5 business days to respond. Their reply came in 2. It was defensive. They claimed the area was historically treated as common access. They said enforcing strict boundaries would be unneighborly. They said damage was minimal. They avoided the rule entirely. No explanation. No acknowledgement. No responsibility. That was their mistake. Because now, I had proof. Not just proof of trespassing. Proof of intentional disregard. I printed the email and added it to the folder. At this point, some people would have gone to a lawyer. I didn't. Not yet. Because the rules offered something better. Something quieter. Something that wouldn't cost me a dime. One evening, I walked the perimeter of my lawn with the property survey in hand. The metal markers were still there, half buried near the sidewalk. The boundary was clear. No gray area. No shared space. My land. I noticed something else too. The HOA had strict landscaping rules. Very strict. Approved materials only. No hazards. No obstructions. Anything installed must comply with safety and design standards. But there was a loophole. A big one. Homeowners were allowed to install decorative boundary features as long as they met height, spacing, and material guidelines. Decorative. Not fences. Not barriers. Decorative features. I read that section 3 times. Then I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because suddenly, I wasn't thinking about stopping people. I was thinking about redirecting them. The rules didn't allow me to block access aggressively, but they allowed me to landscape creatively. That night, I sketched ideas on paper. Nothing dangerous. Nothing illegal. Nothing ugly. Just something that made cutting across uncomfortable, inconvenient, unappealing. Something that followed the rules perfectly. The next day, I visited the local garden center. I walked the aisles slowly. Read tags. Measured spacing. Took photos. Certain plants were approved. Certain decorative stones were allowed. Certain layouts were encouraged. The HOA wanted beauty and uniformity. Fine. I would give them exactly that. I placed the order the following morning. Delivery scheduled for Friday. I didn't tell the HOA. I didn't warn the neighbors. I didn't post signs. I just waited. Because by now, I understood something important. They didn't respect words. They respected consequences. And they had no idea that karma was already on the calendar. Friday morning arrived quiet and clear. No drama. No warnings. Just sunlight and the sound of a truck pulling up to my curb. The delivery was right on time. I stepped outside and watched as the driver unloaded everything neatly along the edge of my lawn. Decorative stones. Low-profile edging. A set of approved plants that matched the neighborhood style perfectly. Nothing aggressive. Nothing sharp. Nothing that could get me in trouble. Anyone driving by would think I was just improving my landscaping. And that was the point. I signed the delivery slip and thanked the driver. As he pulled away, I stood there for a moment and looked at my lawn. The dirt path was still visible. Clear as day. That path was about to disappear. I spent the next few hours working slowly, carefully. I followed the HOA guidelines exactly. Height limits, spacing requirements, materials, everything. I even had the printed rules on a small table next to me, just in case. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't angry. I was precise. First, I laid down the edging. Low, curved, and subtle. It followed the natural shape of the lawn, not a straight line. It looked decorative, intentional. Then I placed the stones. Smooth, rounded, approved size. Spaced just enough to walk around, but not comfortably through. Finally, the plants. Nothing exotic. Nothing spiky. Just dense enough to make stepping through awkward. Enough to make someone think twice. From the sidewalk, it looked great. Clean. Balanced. Exactly the kind of landscaping the HOA loved to show in newsletters. By early afternoon, I was done. I stepped back and wiped my hands. The lawn looked better than it had in months. The damaged grass was covered. The dirt path was gone. In its place was a clear message. This is not a shortcut. I went inside, poured a glass of water, and sat by the window. It didn't take long. The first person came about 10 minutes later. A woman walking briskly, phone to her ear, clearly used to cutting across. She slowed down as she reached the edge. Looked at the stones. Looked at the plants. She hesitated. Then she walked around. I smiled. Just a little. The second person didn't. It was one of the HOA maintenance workers. Same guy I had seen before. Polo shirt. Clipboard. He stepped onto the lawn, stopped short, and stared. He tried to step between the stones. It was awkward. His foot slipped slightly. He caught himself and stepped back. He muttered something under his breath. Then he walked around the sidewalk. That's when I knew. It was working. By evening, I had footage of confusion, frustration, and hesitation. People stopping, turning around, choosing the longer path. No one got hurt. No one was blocked. They just couldn't cut across anymore. And I didn't say a word. That night, my phone buzzed. An email from the HOA. The subject line was short. Landscaping concern. I opened it calmly. They said they had received multiple complaints about changes to my lawn. They asked if I had submitted a request for approval. I replied within the hour. I attached photos. I attached the rule section. I highlighted the part that said decorative boundary features under a certain height did not require prior approval. I ended with one sentence. All installations comply fully with HOA guidelines. No emotion. No sarcasm. Just facts. The response came the next morning. Shorter this time. They said they would review the matter. And that's when things got interesting. Because once you push back on an HOA using their own rules, they don't back down quietly. They escalate. By Monday, I noticed something different. People were walking closer to my house. Slower. Watching. One neighbor stopped me while I was taking out the trash. You really upset them, he said quietly. I asked who. The board, he replied. They don't like being challenged. I nodded. I already knew that. Later that afternoon, a white SUV pulled up. 2 HOA board members stepped out, including the president. She walked up to the edge of my lawn and stopped, arms crossed, eyes scanning the stones and plants like they were evidence at a crime scene. I stepped outside. She didn't greet me. She pointed. This needs to be removed, she said. I asked why. She said it obstructed community movement. I asked her to show me where that was prohibited in the rules. She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "We'll fine you if it stays." That's when I felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Clarity. I told her, calmly, that fines for compliant landscaping would be contested. That I had documentation. That I had footage. That I had emails. Her smile disappeared. She told me I was being difficult. I told her I was being compliant. She turned and walked away without another word. That night, I reviewed my camera footage again. And I noticed something else. The HOA president hadn't walked across my lawn once since the installation. Not once. She walked the long way around. Just like everyone else. By midweek, the dirt path was gone completely. Grass was starting to recover. The lawn looked whole again. But the tension in the neighborhood had thickened. I could feel it. Because when people who rely on power lose convenience, they don't accept it quietly. They look for a way to take it back. And I had a feeling. They weren't done yet. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Plain white envelope. HOA logo in the corner. I knew what it was before I opened it. Inside was a notice of violation. They claimed my landscaping created an unauthorized obstruction and demanded removal within 7 days. If I didn't comply, they would issue a daily fine. I read it twice. Slowly. They had cited the wrong rule. Not just wrong. Completely unrelated. And that told me something important. They weren't confident. They were scrambling. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed the letter next to my folder. Emails. Photos. Camera logs. Rule excerpts. Property survey. Everything neatly organized. I drafted a response that night. Clear. Calm. Professional. I corrected their rule citation. I referenced the correct section. I attached time-stamped photos showing height compliance and spacing. I reminded them that fines must be based on valid violations. I ended with this: please confirm in writing whether this fine will be withdrawn. No threats. No anger. Just a paper trail. 3 days passed. No reply. On the 4th day, another letter arrived. The fine was still active. Now with a warning. That's when I knew this had crossed into something bigger. They weren't trying to resolve an issue. They were trying to reassert control. So I took the next step. I filed a formal appeal. The HOA rules allowed any homeowner to request a violation hearing before the board. They had to schedule it. They had to listen. They had to record it. They didn't like that. But they couldn't refuse. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday evening. I spent the weekend preparing. Not emotionally. Strategically. I printed everything in duplicate. I organized my evidence in order. I prepared short statements. Not speeches. Just facts. I even reviewed state HOA regulations. Just in case. By the time Tuesday came, I felt ready. The meeting room was small. Fluorescent lights. Folding chairs. A long table at the front where the board Saturday. The president was there. So was the maintenance manager. And 2 other board members I barely knew. They looked annoyed. I took my seat and waited. When my turn came, the president spoke first. She said my landscaping violated the spirit of community access. I asked her to point to the exact rule. She couldn't. She said residents were unhappy. I showed footage of residents choosing the sidewalk. I explained the damage to my lawn. The emails. The ignored complaints. The trespassing. I stayed calm. That made them uncomfortable. Then I played the clip. The video of her walking across my lawn. The room went quiet. I didn't accuse. I didn't comment. I just let the footage run. She looked down. The maintenance manager shifted in his chair. I followed with the rule excerpt. Highlighted. Clear. No resident or association representative may use private property as a thoroughfare. I asked one simple question. Does this rule apply to everyone? No one answered. Finally, one board member cleared his throat and said yes. I nodded. Then I asked why the fine had been issued when my installation complied fully. No one had an answer. After a brief closed discussion, they returned. The fine was withdrawn. Reluctantly. No apology. Just a short statement. But something else happened. They warned me. They said any future changes would be closely monitored. That was their way of saving face. I thanked them and left. Walking out of that room felt different. Lighter. But I also knew something. I had embarrassed them. Publicly. And people like that don't forget. The next morning, I noticed the HOA SUV parked across the street. The maintenance manager walked around my lawn with a clipboard. Took photos. I waved. He didn't wave back. Later that day, a neighbor knocked on my door. He looked nervous. "They're talking about changing the rules," he said quietly. I asked which ones. "The landscaping section," he replied. "To stop people from doing what you did." I laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. That evening, I received an email blast from the HOA. Subject: Proposed Rule Update, Community Safety. They claimed the change was about safety. It wasn't. It was about control. The proposal would ban decorative boundary features near sidewalks, including mine. They scheduled a vote for the next general meeting. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about my lawn anymore. Other homeowners were watching. And some of them were tired too. I forwarded the proposal to a few neighbors who had complained to me before. I explained what it meant. I attached the rule language. Within hours, I started getting replies. People were angry. They didn't like rules being changed to punish one homeowner. They didn't like selective enforcement. They didn't like power plays. By the end of the week, the meeting agenda had become the most talked about topic in the neighborhood. The HOA thought they were tightening control. What they didn't realize was this: they had just turned a private dispute into a public one. And karma loves an audience. The night of the general meeting felt heavier than usual. Cars lined the street outside the clubhouse. People who normally skipped meetings were showing up early. Couples. Retirees. Parents with notebooks in hand. I arrived 10 minutes before start time and barely found a seat. That alone told me something was different. The HOA board sat at the front, stiff and quiet. The president kept adjusting her papers. The maintenance manager avoided eye contact with the room. When the meeting began, the tone was formal. Routine items first. Budgets. Landscaping contracts. Noise complaints. Then the president cleared her throat. "Next," she said, "we'll discuss the proposed update to community safety guidelines." That's when heads lifted. She explained the change in careful language. Claimed it would prevent hazards and maintain uniform appearance. She never mentioned my lawn. Not once. But everyone knew. She opened the floor for comments. There was a pause. Then a woman in the second row stood up. She introduced herself. Lived here 12 years. Never spoken at a meeting before. She asked why the rule was being changed so suddenly, and why there had been no incidents before. The president gave a vague answer. Then another hand went up. A man asked why the HOA ignored trespassing complaints but rushed to find compliant landscaping. Another asked why board members were allowed to break rules without consequence. The questions kept coming. I didn't speak yet. I didn't need to. The room was doing it for me. One neighbor shared how the HOA fined her for a mailbox issue while ignoring sidewalk cracks. Another mentioned inconsistent enforcement. The president's face tightened with every comment. Finally, she looked at me. "You may speak," she said. I stood. I kept my voice calm. I explained the situation from the beginning. Briefly. The damage. The emails. The footage. The hearing. The withdrawn fine. I showed one photo. Just one. The dirt path across my lawn. I asked one question. If the rules don't protect private property, what are they for? The room went quiet. Then someone clapped. Then another. The president tried to regain control. She called for the vote. But that's when another board member spoke up. He said they needed more time. That the proposal felt rushed. That community trust mattered. He motioned to table the vote. The motion passed. Just like that. The rule change was postponed. Indefinitely. After the meeting, people stopped me in the parking lot. Thanked me. Shared stories. Some said they'd been afraid to speak up before. The HOA board left quickly. The next day, something unexpected happened. The HOA president sent out an email. Not a threat. An apology. Short. Careful. But real. She acknowledged mistakes in handling the situation. promised better communication, said property boundaries would be respected going forward. I read it twice. I didn't smile. I just felt settled. That afternoon, I walked outside. The lawn was green again. No footprints. No shortcuts. People stayed on the sidewalk. The camera caught nothing. Weeks passed. No fines. No warnings. No letters. The HOA sub stopped parking across the street. And slowly, the neighborhood felt normal again. But there was one final thing. At the next meeting, the president resigned. She said it was for personal reasons. No one questioned it. I never changed a thing about my lawn. And no one ever crossed it again. Because karma didn't arrive loudly. It arrived overnight. And it stayed. After the president resigned, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. People were friendlier. Not because I did anything flashy, but because boundaries were respected. For once, rules were actually enforced fairly. I woke up one morning and walked across my lawn. The grass was soft under my feet. No footprints. No signs of shortcuts. The flowers and stones I had installed still looked neat. They weren't extravagant. Just enough to remind people that this was private property, and that following rules mattered. I realized something important that day. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about respect. Once people respected my property, the tension dissolved. And the HOA learned that rules weren't just words on paper, they had meaning. Neighbors started thanking me quietly. A few even admitted they were too scared to speak up before. Some shared their own stories of minor harassment from the board. One older couple told me they had almost sold their house because the board had made life unbearable for them. I nodded and listened. I didn't need to brag or recount my plan. They already understood. Just standing by my rights had changed things. Even the board, after the president left, became more cautious. They were no longer quick to fine for minor issues. Instead, they consulted property owners first. They measured twice, checked emails, and made sure decisions were fair. The first time I saw them in action, I almost smiled. A new member tried to issue a fine for a small landscaping issue. The board paused, looked at the rules, checked the homeowner's records, and quietly dismissed the complaint. It wasn't me doing it, it was the system I had respected, proving its own strength. I started to notice subtle changes in the neighborhood. People walked more carefully near my lawn, sure. But they also treated each other better. Fewer arguments over minor complaints. Less tension on community paths. My one act of standing up had a ripple effect. And then there was the personal part. I felt empowered. Before all this, I often doubted my own voice. I would see rules being broken or rights being ignored and shrug it off. Not anymore. I had learned that patience, documentation, and strategy could be more effective than yelling or fighting. I could protect what mattered without becoming hostile. The lawn itself became a symbol. Not just for me, but for the community. People would pass by and admire the neat stones and plants, unaware of the battle behind them. Some neighbors even asked for tips on improving their own front yards while staying fully compliant with HOA rules. I shared advice quietly, encouraging them to know their own property rights. The HOA tried one more thing about 6 months later. A minor letter complaining about a small tree near the sidewalk. I responded with the exact rule citation, photos, and documentation. That was the last time I ever had a problem. After that, I stopped checking the mailbox for HOA threats. I didn't have to. They had learned their lesson. Looking back, I realized the emotional journey had been as important as the physical one. I went from frustration to careful observation, from planning to execution, from conflict to resolution. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. But it worked. And in quiet moments, I understood why this story mattered. Not for revenge. Not for proving I was right. But because standing up for myself changed the system for the better. It reminded me, and the neighborhood, that respect and fairness are worth protecting. I often think about that first dirt path across my lawn. It seems trivial now, almost like a distant memory. But at the time, it represented something much bigger. Disregard. Disrespect. A sense that rules were only for some people, not all. By the time the seasons changed, my lawn had fully recovered. Grass thick, plants grown, stones settled perfectly. No more shortcuts. No more damage. And for the first time, I felt that quiet satisfaction you get when you know you did the right thing, and you let life take care of the rest. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about persistence. About knowing the rules, respecting the system, and letting fairness win. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and undeniable. And for anyone watching this story unfold from outside, I hope it teaches one thing. Knowing your rights, being patient, and acting with integrity can change things more than anger or shouting ever could. Because karma doesn't need to scream. It simply works, sometimes overnight, sometimes over months, but it always arrives for those who let the truth guide them. After the fine was withdrawn and the president resigned, the neighborhood slowly began to breathe again. But change doesn't happen overnight, especially in a community where power dynamics had been so one-sided for years. At first, people were hesitant. Conversations that had once been tense were now cautious. Some neighbors would smile and nod when they saw me outside, but there was a lingering air of uncertainty. They wanted to believe things had changed, but they weren't sure it would last. I started noticing subtle shifts in behavior. Parents let their children play near sidewalks without fear of a board member walking over to scold them. People took out the trash on schedule, yes, but without the usual panic of fines or complaints. Small acts, but meaningful. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down, came over with a basket of cookies. She had never been friendly before, always quiet and polite, but distant. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said. Her hands fidgeted nervously. "I've been living here for 20 years, and I've never felt like anyone on the board listened." "You made them listen." I shrugged, trying to seem casual. "It wasn't me, really. Just following the rules and staying calm." She shook her head. "No, it was you. You stood up when no one else would." Her words struck me more than I expected. The validation wasn't just for me. It was for the idea that standing up for what's right mattered. That the system could work when respected. By the next week, more neighbors began speaking up during informal gatherings and neighborhood chats. One man, Mr. Hughes, who had been quiet for years, shared how he had avoided meetings because he feared retaliation. Now, he spoke openly about his own experiences with unfair fines. Even the teenagers who used to cut across my lawn stopped. I didn't need to say anything. They had seen the subtle barriers, the strategic landscaping, and the message was clear: this wasn't a path anymore. Word spread quickly about the lesson learned in the neighborhood. Some residents were discreetly impressed by the way I handled things. No yelling. No lawsuits. Just patience, planning, and following the rules. But not everyone was happy. A few board members who had been loyal to the former president grumbled privately. They complained about how one resident had embarrassed them and disrupted the community. I never confronted them. I let their frustration simmer quietly. It wasn't my fight anymore. Over time, the HOA began consulting residents more frequently before making decisions. They sent emails asking for opinions. They clarified rules. They even held small neighborhood workshops about landscaping and property rights. Slowly, respect for the system, and for homeowners, was being rebuilt. I started feeling proud, but not in a bragging way. More in a quiet satisfaction way. My lawn had become more than just grass and plants, it was a symbol. A reminder that standing up, calmly and respectfully, could make a difference. One sunny Saturday, I was outside trimming the edges when a few neighbors stopped by. They talked about planting flowers, repairing fences, and following rules. They asked me advice, not because I was confrontational, but because I had shown that knowledge and patience were powerful. I realized then that what I had done had created a ripple effect. It wasn't just about my lawn anymore. The neighborhood culture had shifted subtly. Respect for property, fairness, and rules became more than empty words. Even months later, I'd see old board members walking down the sidewalk, careful, measured, and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. They had learned that shortcuts, whether on lawns or in power, come with consequences. For me personally, the experience changed my perspective on community life. I had learned that being passive only gives others more power. That standing up doesn't have to mean confrontation. It can mean preparation, knowledge, and letting evidence speak for you. And the lawn. It became a quiet landmark. Neighbors would casually comment on how nice it looked, unaware of the story behind it. And I didn't need recognition. The lesson had already been delivered. Sometimes I would catch a neighbor glancing at it, nodding, or smiling as they walked past. It was subtle, quiet, but it told me that my actions had made a lasting impression. Not just on the HOA, but on the community as a whole. It also reminded me that patience and strategy could achieve more than anger or immediate confrontation ever could. And it cemented a truth I had long forgotten. Karma works best when you stay calm, follow the rules, and let the system do the heavy lifting. Over time, even new residents learned the unwritten lesson. The subtle boundaries I had installed were still there, in full compliance with HOA rules, but more importantly, the respect for those boundaries was universal. No one crossed my lawn, and the neighborhood culture had shifted quietly but permanently. The ripple effect continued. Other neighbors started taking small steps to assert their rights respectfully. Complaints about selective enforcement began to decrease. People engaged more during meetings. Decisions were fairer. Slowly, the neighborhood became stronger because one person had chosen to act thoughtfully and strategically rather than aggressively. Standing on my lawn one evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, I realized how much had changed. What began as a small battle over grass had grown into a larger lesson about fairness, respect, and the power of doing things the right way. And I knew, deep down, that this quiet victory, this personal justice, was something no one could take away. Not the board, not neighbors, not time itself. Karma had arrived, subtle, effective, undeniable. Months had passed since the HOA president resigned, and the neighborhood had settled into a quieter rhythm. Life went on, but the lessons lingered. Every morning, I walked across my lawn, noticing the grass, the plants, and the stones I had arranged carefully. It all looked peaceful, balanced, perfectly normal to anyone passing by, but for me, it was a reminder of patience, planning, and quiet resilience. I thought a lot about the journey I had been through. About how a simple dirt path across my lawn had triggered so much conflict, and how it had escalated into a test of patience, knowledge, and integrity. I had begun feeling powerless, frustrated, even angry. But by relying on evidence, rules, and thoughtful strategy, I had found a way to restore fairness without confrontation. One afternoon, I sat down with my notebook and reviewed everything I had documented. Emails, photographs, videos, HOA communications, and printed rules. Looking at it all, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a lawn. It was about knowing your rights, asserting them respectfully, and trusting that integrity would eventually prevail. I thought about the neighbors who had thanked me quietly, the parents who finally felt safe letting their children play, and the older residents who had almost given up hope on their homes. Their gratitude wasn't dramatic or public, it was subtle, like nods, smiles, and occasional comments. But it was enough. It was proof that one person, by standing firm yet calm, could influence the community positively. The HOA had learned, too. Even after the president left, the remaining board members were more careful. They consulted residents before making decisions. They clarified rules instead of imposing them selectively. They respected property boundaries in a way they hadn't before. And I realized that, indirectly, I had taught them a lesson as well, one they couldn't ignore. I also reflected on the personal growth I had experienced. Before all this, I often felt reluctant to confront unfairness. I worried about making waves, being labeled difficult, or upsetting neighbors. But this experience taught me that confrontation doesn't always mean shouting or anger. It can mean preparation, patience, and letting evidence do the talking. I had discovered a quiet strength I didn't know I had. One evening, while trimming the lawn, a few neighbors stopped by. They chatted casually about landscaping ideas, small garden projects, and seasonal maintenance. None of them mentioned the conflict explicitly, but I could tell from their tone and gestures that they understood what had happened. Respect had been restored, not just for my property but for the broader sense of fairness in the community. I thought about the HOA president and how she had underestimated me. They believed that rules were flexible for those in power, that residents would simply comply or stay silent. They were wrong. Standing firm, following the rules meticulously, and documenting everything had shifted the balance of power. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it worked. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking about the first time I noticed the dirt path across my lawn. How small and simple the issue seemed at first. Yet it represented a much larger principle, respect. And it reminded me that boundaries, whether physical, emotional, or legal, deserve protection. The neighborhood continued to improve subtly over time. Meetings became more transparent. Decisions were fairer. Selective enforcement decreased. People respected one another more. And while I never sought recognition or applause, I could see that the small act of defending my property had ripple effects far beyond my own lawn. I also thought about karma. Not as revenge, not as some mystical force, but as natural consequence. The HOA had treated rules selectively. They had ignored complaints. They had underestimated a resident's willingness to assert their rights. And through patient, strategic action, the imbalance was corrected. Karma, in this sense, arrived quietly, but powerfully. Looking back, I realized that my approach could have been aggressive, confrontational, even dramatic. But by choosing the calm, methodical path, I preserved relationships where possible, avoided unnecessary conflict, and still achieved justice. And that, in itself, was a lesson I would carry forever. I also noticed the subtle changes in other residents. People began to speak up more in meetings. They monitored enforcement of rules. They respected property lines. And while I didn't actively lead this movement, my actions had set an example. Sometimes the strongest leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about showing what's possible when you act with integrity. Finally, I sat on my porch one evening, sipping tea, and watched the neighborhood settle into quiet evening routines. Children rode bikes, neighbors walked dogs, people returned home from work. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, perfectly ordinary. And yet, for me, it represented something extraordinary. A personal victory achieved without conflict, achieved without drama, achieved through patience, preparation, and respect for rules. I smiled softly. My lawn was more than just grass and plants now. It was a testament to persistence, strategy, and the quiet arrival of karma. And as the sun set, casting warm light across the neighborhood, I realized that justice, when pursued thoughtfully, doesn't need to be loud. It simply works. By the time winter approached, the neighborhood had changed in ways I hadn't fully expected. The subtle landscaping improvements on my lawn had become a quiet benchmark for other residents. People noticed the care, the order, the compliance with HOA rules, but more than that, they noticed the principle behind it. Respect and patience mattered. Neighbors began taking small steps on their own properties. Some trimmed hedges more carefully, others arranged small decorative elements that adhered to HOA guidelines while subtly marking boundaries. None of it was extravagant, but it made the streets look more cared for and orderly. There was a renewed sense of pride in property ownership. One day, Mr. Hughes, the quiet neighbor who had been hesitant to speak up at meetings, approached me while I was working on the lawn. "You know," he said, nodding toward my flower beds, "I never thought standing up quietly could do this much. I mean, people actually listen now." I smiled. It wasn't just me. It was following the rules and letting evidence speak for itself. Sometimes that's louder than yelling. He nodded thoughtfully and walked away, probably inspired to approach his own HOA challenges differently in the future. Even families who had previously ignored rules or relied on shortcuts started respecting them. The stone pathway I had installed remained unchallenged, but it served as a subtle reminder. Crossing boundaries now required thought. No one wanted to break the rules when they could see clearly that they were enforceable and meaningful. At community events, the change became noticeable. Conversations were less tense. People listened more. The HOA, now under new leadership, had begun seeking input from residents before making decisions. Meetings were scheduled with agendas circulated ahead of time, and residents felt they had a voice. There was less fear of arbitrary fines or selective enforcement. I realized something important. The true impact of my actions wasn't just on my lawn. It was on the culture of the entire community. By calmly asserting my rights and following the system, I had influenced change that no amount of shouting or confrontation could have achieved. The former president, who had resigned, occasionally appeared in the neighborhood. She never spoke directly to me, but I sometimes caught her eyeing the lawn as she passed. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. One warm evening, I hosted a small gathering with neighbors. Nothing official, just tea and conversation. People who had once avoided each other now shared stories, advice, and laughter. One neighbor admitted, with a sheepish grin, that they had once cut across my lawn out of habit. Now, they walked politely along the sidewalk, respecting boundaries without complaint. That moment crystallized something for me: the power of quiet, strategic action. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about setting clear, lawful expectations and letting the system work. People saw that fairness mattered and that rules weren't selective. The neighborhood was better for it. Over time, the HOA adopted a more transparent approach to enforcement. They documented warnings, issued notices based on evidence, and listened to resident concerns. Arbitrary fines became rare. The lessons learned from my lawn incident were embedded into their new protocols. I also reflected personally on the experience. Before all this, I often hesitated to assert myself, worried about confrontation or making waves. But this experience taught me that knowledge, preparation, and calm persistence could achieve far more than anger or impulsiveness. I had learned a method of standing up for what's right that was both effective and sustainable. I watched as kids played along the sidewalks, neighbors chatted without fear, and community interactions became friendlier. The quiet ripple effect of standing firm had reached far beyond my property line. Respect, fairness, and integrity were no longer abstract ideas. They were living principles in the neighborhood. Even new residents moving in learned the unspoken rules. They saw the carefully maintained lawn, the boundary stones, and the thoughtful arrangement of plants. They understood, without being told, that respect for property and rules was a shared expectation. I didn't need to intervene. The lesson had become part of the culture. Walking across my lawn one evening, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not pride in the confrontations, not triumph over others, but satisfaction in seeing a community that respected itself. My small actions had contributed to something bigger. By following the rules, documenting evidence, and acting patiently, I had reinforced the importance of fairness and integrity. It wasn't a flashy victory. No lawsuits. No media coverage. Just quiet, enduring change. And in its subtlety, it was far more powerful than any momentary drama could have been. As the seasons changed, the lawn remained healthy, the stones in place, the plants thriving. The shortcut that had once been a daily intrusion was gone. People walked respectfully along sidewalks, and the community operated with a new sense of balance. Sometimes, when I watched neighbors pass, I thought about karma. Not as vengeance, not as punishment, but as natural consequence. Those who had ignored rules learned that respecting boundaries mattered. And those who respected rules saw the benefits of fairness. It wasn't theatrical. It was real. And it lasted. Standing there, I understood a quiet truth. Standing up for yourself, calmly, strategically, and legally, doesn't just protect your property, it can shape the entire environment around you. And in that subtle power lies lasting satisfaction. By the time the following spring arrived, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. One shaped quietly, but unmistakably, by the events surrounding my lawn. The dirt path that had once sliced through the grass was gone. The decorative stones and carefully placed plants remained in place, fully compliant with HOA rules, and more importantly, fully respected by the community. I often walked across my lawn in the early morning, coffee in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. It felt peaceful. The frustration, the conflict, the constant worry, it had all transformed into a quiet sense of triumph. Not triumph in a boastful sense, but the satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing, staying calm, and letting fairness win. Neighbors greeted me differently now. Some who had been hesitant before smiled warmly, sharing stories about minor issues in their own yards or asking advice about landscaping. Others, who had previously ignored the rules or relied on shortcuts, had learned to respect boundaries without ever needing confrontation. Even newcomers to the neighborhood quickly adapted. They understood, almost intuitively, that respect and fairness mattered here. The HOA, now under new leadership, was noticeably different. Board members approached decisions cautiously, often consulting residents first. Rules were enforced fairly, without bias, and documentation became standard practice. Arbitrary fines, once a source of fear, had largely disappeared. Their oversight was now guided by fairness rather than convenience or personal preference. I also noticed the subtle social changes around me. Conversations in the neighborhood were more cordial. People stopped criticizing minor infractions publicly. The culture of fear and selective enforcement had been replaced with one of accountability and mutual respect. All of this, I realized, stemmed from one simple act: standing up calmly for my rights while using the system responsibly. One sunny afternoon, I saw the former HOA president driving by. She didn't stop. She didn't make a scene. But she looked at my lawn, then at the neighborhood around her, and drove off. I didn't need to speak to her or confront her. The results spoke for themselves. Karma had arrived, not in dramatic fashion, but in the natural consequences of fairness prevailing. I thought often about the lessons I had learned. Knowledge of the rules was power. Patience and preparation were stronger than anger. Calm persistence could reshape a situation more effectively than confrontation. And most importantly, integrity could change not just one's own life, but the environment around them. The community itself became a silent testament to those principles. Parents let children play safely on sidewalks. Residents respected property lines. Board members acted cautiously. Meetings became more transparent. Conversations were calmer. The ripple effect of standing firm, quietly but strategically, was undeniable. Even my lawn felt different. It wasn't just grass and plants anymore. It was a symbol of perseverance, respect, and quiet justice. Walking across it, I felt satisfaction that went beyond aesthetics. It represented a personal victory achieved without conflict, a demonstration that patience, knowledge, and calm action could correct injustice. The incidents of trespassing never returned. The dirt path never reappeared. And while I never sought recognition, I realized the story had become part of the neighborhood's collective memory. It was a subtle, shared understanding. Rules apply to everyone, and those who disregard them will eventually face consequences, sometimes quietly but effectively. I reflected on how differently things could have gone. I could have yelled, sued, or confronted aggressively. I could have allowed my anger to control the process. But by choosing a strategic approach, documenting, understanding the rules, and taking patient action, I had not only protected my property but also set a precedent for fairness in the community. Looking back at the journey, I remembered the very first day I noticed footprints across my lawn. How something so small could feel like a violation. How powerless I initially felt. And how, over weeks and months, that small spark of frustration had turned into a lesson in patience, strategy, and integrity. Neighbors still comment occasionally, quietly, about how things changed. Some mention minor victories of their own in handling HOA disputes. Others simply smile when they walk past my lawn, understanding without words the power of calm, lawful action. And for me personally, the experience brought a deeper sense of confidence. I knew that standing up for my rights didn't require aggression or drama. It required knowledge, preparation, and patience. And with those tools, even a small homeowner could correct imbalances, ensure fairness, and inspire change in others. Ultimately, the victory wasn't flashy or publicized. It wasn't on social media, and it didn't need to be. It was quiet, enduring, and unmistakable. Karma had arrived for those who had thought rules didn't apply to them. Justice had been served through preparation, evidence, and integrity. And the neighborhood was better for it. Walking across my lawn one last time before sunset, I felt a profound sense of closure. The grass was healthy. The stones and plants stood in perfect alignment. The path was clear of footprints and shortcuts. The neighborhood was calm, fair, and respectful. And I realized that true justice often comes quietly, steadily, and without drama, but it always arrives for those who act wisely and with patience. In the end, what had started as a simple dispute over a lawn became a story of empowerment, community transformation, and the quiet arrival of karma. And every time I step outside, I'm reminded, standing firm, following the rules, and acting with integrity doesn't just protect your property. It can change the world around you in ways you never imagined.